Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the Southeastern Command that was responsible for preparing forces for cross-channel operations, had been involved in the early planning for the Dieppe raid before being transferred to command of the 8th Army in North Africa in August 1942, just days before the operation was executed. Montgomery had expressed reservations during planning about aspects of the operation, including the decision to assault a defended port directly rather than landing on open beaches away from concentrated German defenses, and about the reliance on surprise when the complexities of coordinating naval movements and timing of multiple landing forces made achieving complete surprise unlikely. Montgomery's concerns were noted during planning meetings, but were not sufficient to cause reconsideration of fundamental aspects of the plan, and his departure for North Africa meant that he was not present during the final planning phases or during the execution that would validate many of his concerns. The choice of Dieppe as the target for a major raid reflected multiple considerations, including the town's location within range of British fighter aircraft operating from bases in southern England, the presence of port facilities and other infrastructure that could be destroyed to demonstrate Allied offensive capability, and intelligence assessments suggesting that while German defenses were substantial, they were not so overwhelming that a properly executed raid could not achieve its objectives before withdrawing. The planners understood that Dieppe's beaches presented challenges, including the shingle composition that would make vehicle movement difficult, the presence of a seawall that would need to be crossed by infantry and vehicles, and the buildings and structures along the waterfront that provided excellent defensive positions for German forces. But the planners believed that these obstacles could be overcome through proper use of supporting fires, through achieving surprise that would prevent German forces from fully manning defensive positions, and through the fighting qualities of Canadian troops who had trained extensively for exactly this type of operation. The training that Canadian forces underwent in preparation for the Dieppe raid was extensive and thorough, with units practicing beach landings, conducting rehearsals of the planned operation against similar terrain in England, and receiving instruction in street fighting and in tactics for assaulting fortified positions. The Essex Scottish Regiment, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Royal Regiment of Canada, the South Saskatchewan Regiment, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and the Fusiliers Mont Royal all participated in training exercises designed to prepare them for the specific challenges they would face at Dieppe. The training built confidence among the troops and their officers that they could execute the plan successfully, creating expectations of success that made the disaster of the actual operation even more psychologically devastating when reality proved so completely different from what training had led them to expect. The security measures implemented to protect information about the raid's timing and target were extensive, with only senior commanders knowing the actual destination until shortly before the operation began, and with elaborate deception measures implemented to mislead German intelligence about Allied intentions. The troops participating in the raid knew they were training for an amphibious operation, but did not know the specific target until they were briefed aboard the ships that would carry them to France. The security measures reflected recognition that German intelligence was active in Britain, and that any leak of information about the raid's timing or target could allow German forces to prepare specifically for the assault, making success impossible. Despite the security measures, some historians have suggested that German forces at Dieppe may have had some warning that an operation was planned based on increased British air activity and on intelligence reports, though there is no definitive evidence that Germans knew specifically that Dieppe would be the target. The naval organization for the raid involved complex coordination of landing craft, destroyers providing gunfire support, and various specialized vessels, including headquarters ships from which commanders would attempt to control the operation. The landing craft included Landing Craft Assault, LCA, that would carry infantry to the beaches, Landing Craft Tank, LCT, that would deliver the Churchill tanks, and various support craft, including craft carrying medical personnel who would treat casualties and who would attempt to evacuate wounded back to England. The destroyers assigned to provide gunfire support included HMS Calpe, HMS Fernie, HMS Brocklesby, HMS Berkeley, HMS Albrighton, HMS Garth, HMS Slazak, and ORP Błyskawica, vessels equipped with 4-inch or 4.7-inch guns that could fire high explosive shells against land targets, but that lacked the heavy armor-piercing shells and the weight of fire that battleships or cruisers could provide. The air plan for supporting the Dieppe raid was among the most ambitious air operations that the Royal Air Force had conducted up to that point in the war, involving coordination of fighter squadrons providing air cover, bomber squadrons attacking targets in the Dieppe area, and ground attack aircraft attempting to suppress German defensive positions. The plan called for continuous fighter patrols over Dieppe throughout the assault to prevent German aircraft from attacking the landing forces and to provide some capability for attacking German positions with cannon and machine gun fire. The bomber operations included attacks on German coastal batteries and on German positions in Dieppe itself, though the accuracy of bombing from medium altitude against small targets was limited, and much of the bombing fell in areas where it did not significantly affect German defensive capabilities. The fighter-bomber operations, using Hurricanes and other aircraft equipped with bombs or rockets, achieved some success in attacking specific targets, but could not deliver the sustained fire needed to suppress German defenses across the entire assault area. The encounter between the landing force and the German coastal convoy during the approach to the beaches east of Dieppe represented the first in a series of unfortunate events that would characterize the operation from beginning to end. The convoy, consisting of German coastal vessels escorted by armed trawlers, stumbled into the landing craft carrying No. 3 Commando in darkness, approximately 5 miles offshore from the landing beaches. The exchange of fire that followed as both sides attempted to identify and engage each other scattered the landing craft and caused casualties among the commandos before they reached their objective. Some landing craft became separated from the main body and landed at wrong locations or at wrong times, destroying the coordination that the plan required and preventing the commando force from achieving its mission to silence the coastal battery at Berneval that could fire on the main Dieppe beaches. The German coastal battery at Berneval consisted of several heavy guns positioned in concrete emplacements designed to engage naval targets attempting to approach Dieppe from the east. The guns were protected by extensive defensive positions, including infantry positions, anti-aircraft guns to defend against air attack, and communication systems linking the battery to German command posts that could coordinate fire missions. No. 3. Commando's mission was to attack the battery from landward, where defenses were less formidable than the seaward-facing positions, to destroy the guns or, at minimum, to prevent them from firing on the Dieppe beaches during the critical period when assault forces were landing. The failure of No. 3 Commando to accomplish this mission due to the encounter with the convoy meant that the Berneval battery remained operational throughout the assault and fired numerous missions against landing craft and against ships offshore, contributing to Allied casualties and disrupting operations. The success of No. 4 Commando's attack on the Varengeville battery west of Dieppe demonstrated what could be achieved through proper execution of commando tactics and through leadership, that adapted to circumstances rather than rigidly following plans that circumstances had rendered obsolete. Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovett commanded the assault with tactical skill and personal courage, dividing his force to attack the battery from multiple directions, coordinating fire support from naval vessels offshore, and maintaining control of the operation despite confusion and casualties. The commandos destroyed the guns, killed or captured most of the German defenders, and withdrew to their landing craft with minimal casualties, representing the only unambiguous success achieved during the entire Dieppe operation. Lovett's success demonstrated that German positions could be taken when assaults were properly planned and properly executed, making the failures elsewhere at Dieppe even more frustrating for those who understood that better planning and better execution might have achieved better results. The German defenders at Dieppe had been warned by their commanders that British raids were possible and had conducted drills practicing response to amphibious assaults, though they did not have specific intelligence that an attack on Dieppe was imminent on August 19th. The defensive positions were manned according to normal rotation schedules rather than being at heightened alert, and the defenders were not expecting an attack when the first sounds of naval gunfire and aircraft engines announced that something was occurring offshore. But the German defensive system was designed to respond rapidly to threats, with alarm systems that could bring all defenders to full readiness within minutes, with prearranged fire plans that allowed weapons to engage targets without requiring detailed orders from commanders, and with reserve forces positioned to counterattack any penetrations of the coastal defenses. The German defensive positions on the cliffs overlooking Puys Beach had been specifically sited to maximize the killing zone that attackers would have to cross, with machine guns positioned to fire along the length of the narrow beach from positions that were protected from return fire by concrete and by the elevation that allowed German gunners to fire down onto anyone on the beach. The Germans had prepared range cards showing exact distances to various points on the beach, had stockpiled ammunition in positions where it would be readily accessible during combat, and had constructed communication trenches allowing defenders to move between positions without being exposed to fire from the beach or from naval vessels offshore. The defensive preparations reflected German understanding that any British attempt to raid Dieppe would likely include assaults on the flanking beaches, and the Germans had prepared accordingly to ensure that such assaults would be repelled with maximum casualties inflicted on the attackers. The Royal Regiment of Canada, approaching Puys Beach in the growing dawn light, could see the cliffs ahead and could see the buildings and structures that dominated the beach. But they could not see the specific defensive positions that German forces had prepared, or understand how completely those positions dominated the landing zone until fire began and the terrible reality became apparent. The German defenders held fire until the landing craft were close to shore, and until the ramps dropped and men began emerging, then opened fire with devastating effect from multiple positions simultaneously. The machine gun fire swept the beach methodically, the German gunners firing in controlled bursts at targets that were clearly visible in the dawn light and that had nowhere to hide on the exposed shingle. The Canadians who survived the initial fire and made it across the beach to the seawall found that the seawall provided some cover from direct fire, but the German positions on the cliffs could still engage them with plunging fire, and that German mortars registered on the seawall were dropping high explosive rounds among the clustered soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Caddo, commanding the Royal Regiment of Canada, was among the first casualties on Puys Beach, killed by German fire as he attempted to organize his troops and get them moving off the beach toward objectives inland. The loss of the commanding officer within minutes of landing disrupted command and control at the critical moment when leadership was most needed, leaving junior officers and NCOs to make decisions about what to do when the situation bore no resemblance to what training and briefings had led them to expect. Some small groups of Canadians attempted to advance off the beach through gaps in the wire obstacles, but German fire killed or wounded most of these men before they could reach cover. Other groups remained pinned against the seawall, hoping that naval gunfire or air attacks would suppress the German positions enough to allow movement, but the supporting fires that might have made movement possible never materialized with sufficient intensity or accuracy to affect German defensive capabilities. The destroyers attempting to provide fire support for the Puys beach assault faced the challenge of engaging targets on cliffs and in buildings when their guns were designed primarily for engaging surface targets at sea level, and when their fire control systems had difficulty identifying specific defensive positions among the general clutter of buildings and terrain features visible from offshore. The destroyers fired numerous shells in the general direction of the German positions, and some rounds struck buildings or ground near German defenders, but the fire was not sufficiently accurate or sufficiently concentrated to destroy defensive positions or to force German defenders to take cover. The German positions were designed to withstand naval gunfire, with thick concrete providing protection against anything except direct hits from heavy shells, and the 4-inch shells that destroyers were firing lacked the destructive power to penetrate the concrete even when they hit positions directly. The soldiers pinned on Puys Beach endured hours of fire from positions they could not effectively engage, watching comrades being killed by German machine gun and mortar fire, treating wounded with inadequate medical supplies and under fire that made proper treatment impossible, and waiting for relief that never came because the force commanders offshore concluded correctly that reinforcing failure would only create additional casualties without affecting the outcome. The decision not to commit reserves to Puys meant abandoning the troops already on the beach to their fate, but committing additional forces would have resulted in those forces suffering the same fate without achieving anything except additional casualties. The brutal calculus of combat forced commanders to make choices between bad options and worse options, with no good options available once the assault had failed so completely in its initial phases. The wounded on Puys Beach faced particularly terrible circumstances, lying exposed on the shingle where German fire could hit them again, and where the tide advancing up the beach threatened to drown men too badly wounded to move themselves above the waterline. The medical personnel who had landed with the assault waves attempted to treat casualties despite lacking adequate supplies, and despite being under fire that made working in the open suicidal. Some medics were killed while treating wounded, German fire making no distinction between combat troops and medical personnel, despite the Geneva Convention requirements that medical personnel wearing identifying insignia should not be deliberately targeted. The wounded who survived until German forces secured the beach after the withdrawal was ordered faced uncertain fates, with some receiving medical treatment from German medical personnel, but others dying from their wounds before treatment could be provided or bleeding to death because German medics prioritized treating German casualties before treating captured Canadian wounded. The main assault on Dieppe's central beaches involved larger forces and more complex coordination than the flanking attacks, with the Essex Scottish Regiment and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landing simultaneously on beaches designated red and white on either side of the casino that was a prominent landmark on Dieppe's waterfront. The plan called for the infantry to advance rapidly across the beach, to breach or climb the seawall, and to fight through the town's streets toward objectives, including the harbor where demolition teams would destroy port facilities and dock installations. The tanks landing in support would provide mobile firepower, would use their guns to destroy German defensive positions, and would create gaps in obstacles that infantry could exploit. The plan assumed that German defenses would be suppressed by preliminary bombardment and by surprise, allowing the assault forces to establish themselves ashore before German reinforcements could arrive to contain the beachheads. The reality that greeted the Essex Scottish and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry bore no resemblance to the plan's assumptions. German defensive fire began as soon as the landing craft approached the beach, with machine guns firing from positions in buildings along the waterfront, from the casino that had been converted into a fortified position, and from pillboxes that had been constructed specifically to defend the beaches. The fire was accurate and sustained, creating beaten zones across the beach where anyone moving was almost certain to be hit, and where finding cover was impossible due to the exposed nature of the terrain. The Canadians who left their landing craft faced a choice between advancing across the beach under fire, where they would likely be killed quickly, or remaining near the landing craft, where they would eventually be killed by mortar fire or by direct fire from German positions that could engage the entire beach. The Essex Scottish Regiment suffered catastrophic casualties within the first minutes of landing, with entire platoons being cut down by machine gun fire as they attempted to cross the beach toward the seawall. The regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Fred Jasperson, was killed early in the assault along with many of his officers, leaving the regiment without effective leadership during the critical period when coordination and direction were most needed. The soldiers who survived the crossing and reached the seawall found that the wall provided some protection, but that German positions could still engage them from elevated positions, and that without suppression of German fires, advancing beyond the seawall would be suicide. Small groups of Essex Scottish soldiers attempted to find gaps in the wire obstacles beyond the seawall and attempted to advance into the town, but German fire killed most of these men before they could penetrate more than a few yards inland. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landing on White Beach fared slightly better than the Essex Scottish, with some groups managing to penetrate into the town and to reach buildings where they could establish defensive positions and from which they could engage German forces. The RHLI commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Labat, survived the landing and attempted to organize his scattered companies for attacks on objectives including the harbor and the headland overlooking the eastern beach. But Labat's attempts to coordinate action were frustrated by communication failures that prevented him from knowing where all his units were or what situations they were facing, by the intensity of German defensive fire that made movement between positions extremely dangerous, and by the absence of effective support from tanks or from other forces that were supposed to assist the infantry in accomplishing their missions. The tanks that landed on Dieppe's main beaches beginning around 0550 hours represented the last hope for turning the deteriorating situation into something resembling success, or at least preventing complete disaster. The 29 Churchill tanks that reached the beach included variants equipped with different armaments, including some with 6-pounder guns that could engage fortified positions with armor-piercing or high-explosive shells, and some with close support howitzers that could fire high-explosive shells at shorter ranges. The tanks were supposed to advance across the beach to cross the seawall using specially designed trackways, or by creating their own crossing points, and to penetrate into Dieppe streets where they would provide direct fire support for infantry fighting through the town toward objectives. The reality was that most tanks became immobilized on the beach or, shortly after crossing the seawall, their tracks unable to gain purchase on the loose shingle, and their weight causing them to settle into the stones rather than riding over them. The tank crews attempting to navigate across the beach found that steering was nearly impossible, with tracks spinning ineffectively and with the tanks slewing sideways down slopes in the shingle rather than maintaining the intended direction of travel. The few tanks that successfully crossed the beach and climbed the seawall encountered a new set of obstacles, including concrete barriers that the Germans had placed across streets to prevent vehicle movement and anti-tank guns that engaged the tanks from positions where the German gunners could fire from cover while the tanks were exposed on the streets. The tank crews fought from their immobilized vehicles, using their guns to engage German positions and to provide what support they could for infantry pinned on the beaches or fighting in the town. The tanks became priority targets for German anti-tank weapons, with German gunners using artillery pieces in direct fire mode and using specialized anti-tank guns to penetrate the Churchill tank's armor. The tank that penetrated furthest into Dieppe reached approximately 300 yards inland before being disabled by German fire and abandoned by its crew after the vehicle caught fire. The burning tank marked the limit of Canadian penetration into Dieppe and represented the futility of continuing to fight when every objective was beyond reach and when remaining on the beaches would only result in additional casualties without affecting the outcome. The decision to commit the reserve battalion, the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, was made around 0700 hours based on fragmentary information reaching the force headquarters ship offshore, suggesting that reinforcements might be able to tip the balance and allow some objectives to be achieved before withdrawal became necessary. The headquarters ship commanders could not see the beaches directly and depended on radio reports from units ashore that were incomplete and often overly optimistic about actual conditions. The decision to commit reserves represented the kind of choice that commanders must make based on incomplete information while under extreme time pressure. And in retrospect, the decision was clearly wrong, given that the Fusiliers landed directly into a situation where they could accomplish nothing except becoming casualties themselves. The Fusiliers Mont-Royal approached the main beach at Dieppe around 11:30 hours in landing craft that came under fire while still offshore, with German gunners engaging the craft with machine guns and light artillery that damaged several craft and caused casualties before the troops could disembark. The Fusiliers who reached the beach found it still under the same devastating fire that had greeted earlier waves, with no cover available and with German positions completely intact despite 2 hours of combat. The Fusiliers attempted to advance across the beach as their training had taught them, but German fire cut them down systematically with machine guns firing from multiple positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every foot of the beach. Lieutenant Colonel Dollard Menard, commanding the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, was wounded multiple times during the landing, but continued attempting to rally his troops and to get them moving off the beach despite his wounds and despite the obvious futility of advancing against intact German defenses. Menard's courage was remarkable and would earn him the Distinguished Service Order, but courage alone could not overcome the combination of German defensive positions, inadequate supporting fires, and the fundamental problems with the operation's conception. The Fusiliers who survived the landing mostly remained pinned on the beach until the withdrawal was ordered, having accomplished nothing except demonstrating once again that the operation was based on assumptions that bore no relationship to reality. The withdrawal order was issued around 900 hours when it became clear to commanders offshore that continuing the operation would accomplish nothing except creating additional casualties without any possibility of achieving objectives or inflicting significant damage on German forces. The order to withdraw created new challenges because extracting troops from beaches under fire was extremely difficult and dangerous, with landing craft having to approach shores where German fire could engage them throughout the approach and where damaged craft might block access for other vessels attempting evacuations. The withdrawal plan called for landing craft to approach the beaches at designated times, to load soldiers as quickly as possible, and to withdraw before German fire destroyed the craft or killed everyone aboard. The reality of the withdrawal was chaos and desperation, with landing craft approaching beaches that were still under intense German fire, with wounded and unwounded soldiers attempting to wade through surf to reach craft that couldn't beach completely due to obstacles or damaged craft blocking approaches, and with German fire continuing to cause casualties among men attempting to evacuate. Some landing craft reached the beaches and successfully loaded troops before withdrawing with casualties, but with the craft intact and operational. Other craft were hit by German fire and disabled, forcing evacuation of troops to other craft or leaving soldiers stranded on the beach when the damaged craft couldn't reach them. The officers and NCOs attempting to organize the withdrawal under fire displayed courage and leadership that would have been commendable in any circumstances, but that was particularly remarkable given the conditions they were operating under and the knowledge that they might have simply abandoned troops and saved themselves. The decision about who would evacuate and who would remain behind when insufficient landing craft were available created terrible moral dilemmas for officers who had to choose between attempting to evacuate everyone and risking losing all the landing craft, or evacuating those who could reach the craft while leaving behind wounded and those who were too far from the water's edge to make it to the boats before German fire killed them. The wounded who could not walk faced particularly grim prospects, with some being carried to landing craft by comrades who risked their own lives to save friends, and others being left on the beach because carrying them through fire would have been suicide and would have prevented the unwounded from evacuating. The officers who made these decisions carried guilt about abandoning wounded for the rest of their lives, understanding intellectually that they had made the only rational choices possible, but never fully accepting emotionally that they had been forced to make such choices. The final landing craft departed the beaches around 1100 hours, approximately 5.5 hours after the initial landings and 2 hours after the withdrawal order had been issued. The craft carried approximately 3,000 survivors from the approximately 5,000 Canadians who had landed, leaving approximately 2,000 dead, wounded, or captured on the beaches and in Dieppe. The survivors who made it back to England were exhausted, traumatized, and in many cases wounded, their uniforms and equipment covered in blood and beach debris. The return voyage across the Channel was conducted under German air attack, with Luftwaffe bombers and fighters attempting to sink the landing craft and the destroyers protecting them, though RAF fighter cover prevented most German aircraft from pressing attacks home effectively. The Germans who secured the beaches after the withdrawal ended found scenes that provided powerful material for propaganda, but that also shocked some German soldiers who had not experienced such concentrated carnage even on the Eastern Front, where combat had been brutal and casualties heavy. The bodies of Canadian soldiers lay scattered across the beaches in positions where they had fallen, some in groups where machine gun fire had caught entire squads, others individually scattered where men had fallen while attempting to cross the beach. The wounded who had been left behind were collected by German medical personnel and were treated in German medical facilities in Dieppe, with treatment quality varying depending on the personnel involved and on the resources available, but generally meeting minimum standards required by Geneva Convention. The prisoners captured at Dieppe, approximately 1,946 Canadians, were searched, interrogated briefly to gather tactical information, and then transported to prisoner of war camps in Germany where they would spend the remainder of the war. The conditions in the camps were harsh, but generally within Geneva Convention requirements, with adequate food to prevent starvation, though not to maintain health, with medical care for serious conditions, though not for minor ailments, and with protection from deliberate mistreatment, though not from the privations inherent in captivity during wartime. The prisoners organized themselves into military units, maintaining some semblance of structure and discipline, conducted educational programs to keep minds active, and planned escape attempts that occasionally succeeded, though most prisoners would remain in German custody until camps were liberated by Allied forces in 1945. The air battle over Dieppe on August 19, 1942, represented one of the largest single-day air engagements of the war up to that point, with RAF and Luftwaffe committing hundreds of aircraft to battle for control of the airspace over the assault area. The RAF deployed approximately 70 squadrons, including Spitfire fighters, Hurricane fighter bombers, and various bomber types that attacked German positions and attempted to protect the landing forces from air attack. The Luftwaffe responded by committing substantial fighter forces from bases in France and by launching bomber attacks against the ships offshore and against the beaches where they could hit concentrations of Allied troops and equipment. The air combat resulted in approximately 106 RAF aircraft lost, including fighters and bombers shot down by German fighters or by anti-aircraft fire, representing the highest single-day loss total for the RAF during the war. German losses totaled approximately 48 aircraft, significantly lower than RAF losses and representing a favorable exchange ratio from the German perspective. The RAF's numerical superiority prevented the Luftwaffe from completely dominating the airspace over Dieppe and prevented German bombers from attacking the landing forces with the intensity that might have inflicted even greater casualties. But the RAF could not achieve the level of air superiority that would have allowed effective close air support for ground forces or that would have prevented German fighters from contesting control of the airspace. The political aftermath in Canada saw the government facing difficult questions about why Canadian forces had been committed to an operation that resulted in such catastrophic casualties, and about whether Canadian interests had been properly considered in the decision-making process. Prime Minister Mackenzie King faced criticism from opposition parties and from media outlets that questioned whether the raid had been necessary and whether proper care had been taken to ensure the Canadian forces were not being expended in operations serving British strategic interests rather than Canadian national interests. King defended the operation by emphasizing the lessons learned, by arguing that Canadian forces had demonstrated their courage and fighting qualities despite the operation's failure, but the political damage was significant and lasting.